The message came without warning. No greeting, no explanation, just a sentence that felt rehearsed like something practiced in front of a mirror. He said he would be better off without me. I read it twice, then a third time, waiting for the rest of it to appear. It never did. The house was quiet, too quiet for December. By morning, my number was blocked, my name removed from the family group. My existence reduced to a silence no one questioned. They all knew something I didn't. And whatever it was, it had already been decided. I have always understood my father best in silence. Not the kind of silence that feels peaceful, but the kind that settles after something has been decided without being said. That was how things worked in our house. Decisions did not arrive as conversations. They appeared as outcomes. You learn to adjust, or you learn to stay out of the way. I chose the second. Our days followed a structure that never needed explanation. Breakfast at the same time. The same seat at the table. The same newspaper folded in half beside his plate, even when he no longer read it. My father believed in appearances, in continuity. If something looked unchanged, then it was easier to pretend it was. He rarely spoke more than necessary. When he did, it was measured. Not cold, exactly, just precise. As if every word had already been tested before it reached the surface. I learned early that asking questions created friction. Not arguments. He did not argue. He corrected, quietly, and once corrected, the subject was closed, so I stopped asking. It made things easier. People outside our family often described him as disciplined, reliable, the kind of man who built things that lasted. They respected him in a way that did not invite closeness. I used to think that was normal. That distance was just another form of care I had not learned to recognize yet. We did not celebrate much, but we observed everything. Birthdays were acknowledged with brief, careful gestures. Holidays followed a pattern so consistent that nothing about them required thought, especially December. December belonged to him. The house would shift slightly as the month began. Decorations appeared, but never all at once. A wreath on the door, lights along the window, evenly spaced. A tree placed in the corner of the living room, always the same height, always decorated in the same order. He did it himself. No one offered to help. No one interrupted. I used to watch from the hallway, not because I was told to stay there, but because it felt like the correct place to be. He never asked me to join him, and I never asked if I could. That was our balance. There were no arguments in our house, no raised voices, no slammed doors. From the outside, it looked controlled, stable. People assumed that meant peaceful. It was not peaceful. It was managed. My role in all of this was simple. I did not create problems. I did not require attention. I handled what was given to me and stayed within the lines that had already been drawn. Over time, that became its own kind of identity. Quiet, reliable, uncomplicated, predictable. It made me easy to overlook. I noticed things because of that, not in a deliberate way at first, just small details that did not matter to anyone else. The way his phone was always placed face down on the table, except when he was expecting a call. The way certain documents were kept separate from the rest, locked in a drawer he rarely opened in front of others. The way conversations with extended family happened behind closed doors, even when there was nothing urgent being discussed. None of it felt important, not on its own. It was just the shape of our life. Trust in our house was not something that was spoken about. It existed in routine, in repetition, in the assumption that things would continue as they always had, and they always did. Until they didn't. But before that, there was no clear moment where anything felt broken. No single conversation that shifted everything. If there were changes, they were too small to name at the time, too gradual to interrupt the pattern. I continued as I always had. I showed up when expected. I listened more than I spoke. I stayed where I was placed, and in return I believed, quietly, without questioning, that there was still a place for me in whatever structure my father was maintaining. Not because he said it, but because he had never said otherwise. That was enough, or at least it had been. Looking back, I understand how much of that trust was built on absence, on things that were never tested, never confirmed. It felt stable because nothing had forced it to prove itself. I did not realize that silence could also be preparation, that decisions could be forming long before they reached me, and that by the time I noticed anything at all, it would already be too late to ask why. The first change was small enough to ignore. It happened in the middle of an ordinary evening, the kind that passed without leaving any impression. I walked into the living room expecting nothing and found my father on a call. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was how quickly he ended it. Not gradually, not with the usual measured closing. Just a pause, a glance in my direction, and then silence. He placed the phone face down on the table, as he always did. But this time, he kept his hand over it for a moment longer than necessary. I didn't say anything. I moved through the room, sat down, and reached for the book I had been reading earlier. The air felt slightly altered, like something had been interrupted rather than completed. Still, nothing that could be named. Moments like that began to repeat, not often, just enough to register if I paid attention. Conversations would soften when I entered a room, not stop entirely, but shift. Words became more careful, less specific. Names were replaced with generalities. Plans became vague. At first, I assumed it was coincidence, timing. But coincidence, I have learned, rarely follows a pattern. There were messages, too, small ones. Practical things that normally would have included me without question. Family plans mentioned after they had already been decided. Updates shared as conclusions rather than discussions. "You don't need to worry about it." That became a common phrase. It was always said calmly, almost reassuringly, as if exclusion was a form of protection. I accepted it the way I had accepted everything else, without resistance. It fit the role I had always occupied. Still, there was a moment, quiet, brief, that stayed with me longer than the others. It happened at dinner. Nothing unusual about the setting. Same table, same arrangement. The rhythm of utensils against plates filling the space where conversation rarely existed. My father asked a question. Not to me, to someone else. It was about a decision, something financial, I think. The details were not clear, only the tone. It was not a question seeking input. It was confirmation, as if something had already been agreed upon, just not in front of me. I looked up, expecting the conversation to open. It didn't. The answer came quickly, quietly. And then the subject ended. No one turned to include me. No one explained what had just been decided. It was a small thing. But it did not feel small. I remember noticing the way my father avoided looking in my direction for the rest of the meal. Not deliberately, not in a way that would draw attention, just consistently, as if eye contact might require acknowledgement. I lowered my gaze back to my plate and continued eating. That was what I always did. Maintain the surface. If something was wrong, it would reveal itself eventually. There was no need to force it. That had always been my approach. Observation instead of interruption. But the observations were beginning to accumulate. His schedule changed in subtle ways. He left earlier in the mornings, returned later in the evenings. When I asked simple questions, practical ones, not intrusive, his answers became shorter, more contained. "Work!" That was usually enough to end the conversation. Other family members adjusted around him. I could see it in the way they responded. Quick glances exchanged when certain topics came up. Slight pauses before answering questions that should have been immediate. No one said anything directly, and that more than anything was what felt different. Silence in our house had always been normal, but this silence was coordinated. It carried intention. It was not the absence of information. It was the management of it. I tested it once. Not openly, just a small deviation from routine. I asked about a date I had overheard in passing, something scheduled close to the holidays. My father's response came without hesitation. "It's handled." Nothing more, no explanation of what it was, no clarification of why it did not concern me, just closure. I nodded as if that was sufficient, because that was what was expected. After that, I stopped asking again. Not because the questions disappeared, but because the answers had already shown me their limits. Instead, I paid attention to tone, to timing, to the spaces between words. The house remained the same on the surface. The routines held. December continued to unfold the way it always had, decorations appearing one by one, the structure intact, the appearance of normal preserved with careful precision. But underneath, something had shifted, not abruptly, not visibly, just enough to create distance where there had once been assumption. And I began to understand, slowly, quietly, that whatever was changing, it was happening without me. The first real indication did not come from a conversation. It came from something that was never meant for me to see. I wasn't looking for it. That is the part I return to most often. There was no intention behind it, no curiosity that led me there, just routine. I was in his study because I had been asked to retrieve a folder, something unrelated, something ordinary. The kind of small task that reinforced trust without requiring it to be spoken. His study was always precise, not clean in the traditional sense, but controlled. Everything had a place. Papers were stacked in exact alignment. Drawers closed fully, never left slightly open. Even the desk itself carried a kind of quiet authority, as if it reflected him more than anything else in the house. I knew where the folder should have been. Second drawer on the left. When I opened it, something was different, not immediately obvious, just a slight disruption in the pattern. The documents inside were arranged correctly, but one section toward the back was out of sequence. Thicker. Recently placed. I should have ignored it, closed the drawer, taken what I needed, and left. That would have been consistent with everything I had done before, but I didn't. I paused, only for a moment, long enough to notice the tab. It didn't match the others. The label was typed, not handwritten. That alone would not have meant anything, except for the fact that he always wrote his labels himself. It was one of those small, unnecessary habits that never changed. I slid the section forward just enough to read it. A name, his, and beneath it a term that did not belong in anything routine. Revision. I felt something shift, but it was not panic, not even concern, just a quiet recognition that this did not fit into the system I understood. I didn't open the file fully. I didn't need to. There were details visible without searching. Dates, recent ones, signatures that had already been completed, language that was formal, structured, legal. And then a line that stood out only because of its absence. My name was not there. At first, that did not register as significant. Documents change, details evolve. It could have been a draft, a temporary adjustment, something incomplete. But the signatures suggested otherwise. This was not in progress. It was finalized. I closed the drawer exactly as I had found it. Took the folder I had been asked for. Left the room without hesitation. Nothing in my movement changed. Nothing in my expression would have suggested that anything had shifted, but something had. The rest of the day continued as expected. Routine held. Conversations, what little there were, remained controlled and uneventful. My father did not behave differently, not in any way that could be clearly identified. That was what made it difficult to place. If something significant had happened, there should have been a visible change, a shift in tone, a difference in behavior. There was. And yet I had seen something that did not align with everything that came before it. That evening I paid closer attention, not outwardly, Nothing that would draw notice, just small adjustments in where I placed my focus. He received a call just after dinner. I watched the way he answered it, the pause before he spoke, the way his voice lowered not in volume but in range, controlled, careful. "Yes," he said, a pause. "It's already done." Another pause. "No, there won't be any complications." I looked down at my plate before he could look up. The conversation ended shortly after. He placed the phone face down again, exactly as he always did. But this time, I noticed something I had missed before. His hand remained there, not out of habit, but with intention, as if ensuring that nothing more would come through while anyone else was present. I didn't ask about the call. I didn't reference the document. I didn't do anything that would suggest I had seen what I wasn't meant to see. That was not restraint, it was calculation, because for the first time the pieces were beginning to connect, not fully, not clearly, but enough to understand that whatever was being arranged, it had already moved beyond discussion. And whatever role I thought I had within this family, whatever place I believed was understood without being spoken, was no longer part of the structure being maintained. I remained where I had always been, quiet, observant, uninvolved. But now I was watching something take shape, something deliberate, something final. And for the first time, I understood that the silence I had trusted for so long was not neutral. It was hiding something. When I finally spoke, it was only a whisper, not in the sense of volume, but in its effect. I had rehearsed it in my mind a dozen times, crafting the question carefully so it could not be dismissed outright, just enough to probe without accusing. I wanted clarity. Why wasn't I included in this decision? The room grew still. Not the comfortable stillness of attention, not the ordinary quiet of our house. This was different. Heavy. Controlled. The kind of silence that was meant to make you doubt yourself before anyone even spoke. My father's eyes lifted slowly from the papers he had been examining. He studied me, not with surprise, not with irritation, but with the calm precision of someone evaluating whether an error had been made in your perception. "You must be mistaken," he said, not sharply, not defensively, just stated, flat, as if my observation was the only anomaly in an otherwise orderly world. I repeated the question carefully, softer this time. "I noticed the documents. Why wasn't I included?" A faint sigh, not audible to anyone else, but I felt it. It carried the weight of exasperation. And then the words, "You're imagining things. That folder was irrelevant to you." I paused. The phrasing was deliberate, not an answer. Not a denial of action, just a dismissal of my perception. I tried again, hesitant now. "It looked important, You're overthinking it," he interrupted, gently enough to mask the control, firmly enough to make resistance pointless. "You've always been careful about minor details, that's good, but sometimes your caution creates problems where none exist." I swallowed, I nodded, because that was what I had learned. That was what we did. We complied. We did not argue with precision. We observed. We adapted. Other family members were there. Watching, they did not speak. They did not intervene. But the expression on my mother's face told its own story, mild concern quickly repressed, a reflection of the same lesson I had already learned. Questions have consequences. Silence is safer. Even so, I remembered the folder, the label, the signatures. I remembered the call. I remembered that sense of deliberate exclusion. But every time I tried to align my memory with reality, they offered me a different version. A corrected, softer, more manageable truth. "You're seeing patterns where there are none. You're imagining things. You've always been cautious, don't let it control you." The repetition of these phrases was itself a pattern, and yet I remained uncertain. Not about what I had seen, but about my right to insist it mattered. Even as the whisper of suspicion became a steady hum, I kept my voice quiet, small. Restricted, not because I doubted myself entirely, but because that was the only way to survive intact. To react openly was to invite control, to give weight to accusations I had not yet confirmed. So I listened, I watched, I waited, and the subtle pressures increased. Dinner conversations shifted. My questions were met with polite correction. My observations were reframed as exaggerations. The air carried a faint tension, thin but persistent. I felt eyes on me in moments when no one should have been watching. A simple question about schedules became a test. A casual remark about documents was answered with a calm but unmistakable implication that I was misremembering, misreading, misunderstanding. Even the family dog seemed to notice the change, retreating from the room when I entered, leaving me isolated in small, domestic ways I had never noticed before. It was relentless in its quietness. No accusations were made. No confrontations erupted. Instead, a web of doubt formed, around me, inside me. I began to replay every interaction, every pause, every glance, every subtle shift in routine. Had I misinterpreted the folder, the phone call, the arrangement of papers in his study? I forced myself to believe I could be wrong. I had to. It was easier than challenging them. Safer. But each day, the evidence I could not fully acknowledge persisted. The documents, the calls, the changes in behavior. They existed whether I was allowed to see them or not, and every time I tried to confront them, the narrative shifted. You're imagining things. You're overreacting. You're too cautious. The words themselves became a barrier, a gentle, quiet wall designed to contain my perception. By the end of that week, I realized something I could not speak aloud. This was not just oversight, not just neglect, it was deliberate. And in that moment, I understood the shape of the trap. Not loud, not violent, not dramatic, just methodical, quiet, and entirely invisible unless you were willing to watch with patience, with restraint, and with memory as your witness. It started with a letter, not addressed to me, of course. Nothing in my name had arrived, nor would it. That was part of the design. But I found it tucked between the pages of a magazine in the living room, an unintentional oversight I later realized. The envelope was plain, legal in appearance, stamped with a firm I recognized but had never interacted with directly. I hesitated before touching it. Part of me wanted to close it immediately to pretend it didn't exist. Another part, an instinct I had learned through years of quiet observation, urged me to notice. The handwriting was not my father's. It was precise, intentional, professional. But the postmark, the return address, it all traced back to him. I unfolded the letter carefully, aware that my discovery would change nothing immediately but would matter later. The contents were matter-of-fact, almost clinical. Decisions had been made, arrangements confirmed, sums of money moved. Legal language dictated inheritance and authority. And then the detail that stopped me cold, my absence, not a minor omission, not a passing mention. My name was missing entirely from the plan I had always assumed included me. The moment was quiet, unremarkable to anyone else in the room, yet it reverberated inside me. I pressed the letter to the desk, closed my eyes, and let the realization settle. I had been removed, not by accident, not because of oversight, but because someone had decided, carefully and deliberately, that I did not belong. Over the next few days, I noticed more signs. The phone call I had overheard weeks ago made sense in a way it hadn't before. The folder in the study, its misaligned label, its carefully typed tab now revealed its purpose. Patterns emerged from the chaos of subtlety. I began to track things quietly. Nothing in my behavior changed outwardly. I continued with my routine, maintained the appearances, fulfilled my expected tasks. But mentally, I cataloged everything: dates, documents, conversations. Even systems became witnesses. Bank notifications that arrived for my father alone. Account statements with entries I had never authorized, legal correspondence addressed to him, referencing changes I had no knowledge of. Each paper, each digital record, confirmed what I had begun to suspect. One evening, a neighbor inadvertently added to the picture. She mentioned casually that she had spoken with my father about holiday plans that included extended family members, but not me. Her tone was unaware, neutral, devoid of any intention to hurt. But for me, the implications were devastating. This was not a matter of oversight. It was a deliberate exclusion, confirmed externally, validated by systems and witnesses I could not control. Even the family dog, previously indifferent, now avoided certain rooms at certain times. It was subtle, meaningless in isolation, yet consistent with patterns I had cataloged. I remember sitting at the kitchen table that night, the letter still folded in front of me. I didn't call anyone. I didn't ask questions. I didn't move the papers, I just watched. Observation had become my only tool, not because I was passive, but because action, outward expression, would only draw attention to what I was beginning to recognize as manipulation. I noticed small signs of strain in him, too. My father's routines, once flawless, now carried inconsistencies. A meeting rescheduled without notice. A call ended abruptly, mid-sentence. A stack of documents shifted, seemingly forgotten, left in plain sight. It was as if the mechanisms he had used to maintain control were starting to fray, not because I acted, but because the system itself could not hide everything at once. A colleague of his, someone I had seen at family gatherings but never spoken with directly, made a passing comment in my presence. "It's all in order now. Everything has been settled legally." Nothing more. No context. No explanation. But it was enough. Enough to confirm what I had begun to understand. The exclusion was intentional, finalized, irreversible. I allowed myself a single thought that night, spoken only internally. The truth exists, even if no one acknowledges it. That thought was comforting in a strange, brittle way. Because while I could not yet confront, could not yet act, I could witness. And observation, after all, is the quietest form of power. I did not speak. I did not accuse. I did not show recognition. But I recorded it all mentally, placing each detail carefully into the archive of my awareness. If I had been underestimated before, I would no longer be. They did not see me as present, but I was, and I would continue to be. Every misstep, every assumption, every omission would be noted. Even in silence, I could bear witness. And bearing witness, I knew, was the beginning of accountability, whether they understood it or not. I finished the letter and returned it exactly where it had been. The systems remained unchanged. The room remained quiet. The house continued its routines, but I had shifted from passive observer to deliberate witness. And once you reach that point, nothing hidden remains entirely safe. The walls of control, so carefully constructed, now had cracks, small ones nearly imperceptible, but the light could reach through them. And light, even in minimal amounts, has a way of revealing everything. The shift was subtle at first, almost imperceptible. But it was there, threaded through the air like an electric current that made your skin tingle without warning. My father's movements changed. Not in grand gestures, not in ways anyone outside the house could have noticed, but in the way doors closed, the way his gaze lingered on documents before he left a room, the almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw when he spoke to others. I understood then that he had sensed I was aware. Not fully, not openly, but enough. Enough to recognize that the carefully constructed order was being observed by someone he hadn't accounted for. At first, it was managed avoidance. Calls were shorter. Invitations disappeared without explanation. Even routine acknowledgments, birthday greetings, check-ins, casual questions about my day were omitted. My presence became less convenient. I remained quiet. I maintained my routine. I kept myself within my established boundaries, fulfilling obligations and ensuring that no one could accuse me of overstepping. But the system was tightening. Documents I had previously glimpsed began to vanish entirely. Letters redirected. Access restricted. The study door, once unlocked during the day, was now closed, even when he was not present. Patterns I had relied on to understand the household shifted under my gaze, leaving me to infer new rules without guidance. And he began to test me. Small things, nothing overt. A question phrased vaguely. A statement loaded with implication. A glance that lingered just long enough to register in peripheral vision. "Yes, I thought you knew about it," he would say, implying responsibility for knowledge I could not possibly have. Or, "I assumed you had understood what was happening." In both cases, my silence was demanded, and I gave it willingly. It was safer to remain restrained, to wait, to allow the situation to reveal itself without adding fuel to the fire. I watched, cataloging, noting. The escalation grew more deliberate. Invitations to family events were replaced with announcements I received by text or email after the fact. Financial updates I had once casually observed now arrived only in filtered form. Information that had once trickled into my awareness through incidental glimpses was now withheld entirely. He did not speak of it, of course, never directly. He maintained his calm authority, but there was a tension beneath it, controlled, deliberate, restrained. A machine operating quietly but with precision. I began to notice the reactions of others around him. My mother, always careful, now shifted in subtle ways when certain topics arose. Extended family members asked me questions in guarded tones, only to receive neutral, practiced responses. The household had become a system of controlled perception, designed to exclude me without a confrontation, to maintain appearances while altering reality. I remember one particular evening. He had left the house for a meeting, leaving a series of documents on his desk. I entered briefly to retrieve a routine folder and noticed another file out of place. The cover was different, typed, legal, unmistakably recent. I opened it just enough to glimpse the contents. Exclusion confirmed again. Not minor, not accidental. Finalized, structured, undeniable. A chill ran through me. Not fear exactly, not yet, but a recognition of the full scope of what was occurring. I left the documents untouched. I did not confront. I did not speak. I walked away with my mind cataloging every detail, every pattern, every deviation from routine that now carried significance. The escalation continued over the following days. Conversations with him were measured, short, controlled. He monitored the space between words, the pause before responses, the micro-expressions that betrayed nothing but revealed everything. His body language suggested control, but the subtle signs of unease told me that he was aware I had begun to understand the architecture of his decisions. I had to remind myself not to respond too quickly, not to show recognition, not to give away the fact that I knew, because recognition would invite countermeasures, and there was no room for countermeasures. Not yet. The household became an intricate dance of avoidance. I moved through rooms carefully, noting what was present, what was absent, and how the patterns shifted with each passing day. Mail was redirected, phone calls avoided, schedules altered. The systems themselves, once predictable, had been adapted to exclude me entirely. Yet in this silence, I discovered something unexpected. Mistakes, imperfections, small cracks in the careful orchestration. A letter sent to the wrong address. A document left where I could glimpse it without suspicion. A conversation overheard through the faintest opening in a door. The betrayer had become human in subtle ways, revealing that even the most controlled system could not eliminate oversight entirely. I observed, patiently, silently. The escalation was no longer just a shift in behavior, it was a tightening of control. And yet, within it, a vulnerability emerged. I cataloged every signal, every oversight, every micro fault in the structure. Every omission, every subtle misstep, every instance where intention and reality failed to align. I did not act. I did not confront. I waited. Because the more deliberate the control, the more telling the slips. And the more evidence I accumulated, the more undeniable the truth would become. The house had transformed into a system of exclusion. Every door closed, every word measured, every interaction curated. And I existed within it as both witness and participant, moving through the motions while gathering proof with meticulous restraint. By the end of the week, it was clear. He was reacting to my presence in ways he could not fully control. The escalation had reached a point where his efforts to maintain authority and exclusion had begun to create vulnerabilities. Patterns emerged more visibly, errors became traceable, and cracks in his control system appeared. And I remained calm, quiet, watching, the silent observer in a household of calculated deception, waiting for the truth to reveal itself fully, inevitably, and without interference. By the time I reached that point, the weight of it all had settled into my bones. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't marked by an argument or a confrontation. It was quiet, gradual, like water eroding stone until the shape of the landscape has changed and you can't remember what it looked like before. I had cataloged everything by then. Letters, documents, missed conversations, redirected calls, the absence of my name where it had always belonged. Patterns that once seemed minor had revealed themselves as deliberate. Exclusion was not accidental. Control was not benign. And my father, who had always maintained the illusion of measured authority, had weaponized it. I remember sitting at my desk that night, the house silent except for the faint hum of the heater. I had a folder in front of me, the one I had discovered weeks earlier. I traced the edges with my fingers without opening it, knowing the contents as well as I had known my own hands. Anger flared briefly, then dissipated. Frustration pressed against my chest, but I did not speak. I did not call anyone. I did not confront him, because by then I understood what my role had to be. Observation, restraint, documentation. Action would not undo the betrayal. It would only make it more visible to those who were already invested in maintaining it. I thought of the years before, when I had believed that silence meant peace. That careful adherence to the rules, compliance with routines, and avoidance of conflict preserved my place. I realized now how easily I had been misled. Silence had protected me, yes, but it had also concealed their intent. And now even my careful observation had to be measured against the consequences of exposure. I made a decision then, a conscious choice I had never had to make before. I would not react. I would not demand acknowledgement. I would not seek justice in a way that would draw attention. I would wait. I allowed myself to acknowledge the emotional cost without acting on it. It was heavy. It pressed down with the subtlety of gravity rather than the force of a blow. The grief was quiet but profound. Loss without ceremony. Betrayal without spectacle. There were moments when my hands itched to write an email, make a phone call, ask a question I already knew the answer to. But I resisted. Each restraint, each deliberate act of non-reaction was itself a form of assertion. It was a way to preserve clarity and control in a situation where everything else had been manipulated. I spent hours reviewing what I knew. mapping connections, cataloging deviations, reconstructing patterns. The exclusion, the letters, the altered routines, all pointed to a deliberate plan. I did not need confirmation. I had enough evidence to know. But knowledge was a private thing. Recognition could be denied externally, but internally it could not be erased. That night, I walked the halls of the house slowly, listening to the quiet of rooms that once felt safe. Every creak, every sigh of the walls, every faint echo of footsteps reminded me of the isolation that had been engineered. I was present, but only as a witness. Participation was a privilege I no longer held. I thought of my father, of his careful, controlled authority, of the way he had orchestrated exclusion with precision. I did not feel hatred. Not yet. Just an acute awareness of power and how it had been wielded against me. And I understood clearly that confronting it would serve only to reinforce his control. Silence, observation, and patience were now my tools. I spent the next hours in quiet reflection, not plotting revenge, not rehearsing confrontation, not even lamenting the loss of the relationship I had assumed existed, just recognition and acceptance. Acceptance of what had been done, of what I had endured, and of the limits of my influence in that moment. The emotional breaking point was not a scream. It was a calm understanding. The truth existed even if no one acknowledged it. The betrayal was real even if it could not be corrected immediately. The cost was mine to bear, silently, deliberately, as I had always borne the weight of observation in a house ruled by unseen authority. And in that acceptance, I found a measure of clarity. Not comfort, not relief, not even satisfaction, just clarity. I did not celebrate. I did not show triumph. I did not tell anyone what I knew. I watched, I catalogued, I waited, because the truth, like water, finds its own path eventually. And when it did, I would be ready not with anger, not with accusation, but with understanding. I could endure, I could observe, I could restrain. The emotional breaking point was not about losing control. It was about claiming it in a way no one else could touch. And I had done that, silently, completely. And it was heavy, and it was enough. The consequences did not arrive with drama, no raised voices. No confrontation. No revelation at a family dinner or in some grand gesture. They arrived quietly, slowly, through systems that could not be denied and witnesses who could not ignore what they saw. I noticed it first in the mail. Letters addressed to him, once routine, now included documents he could not simply manage without scrutiny. Legal notifications, confirmations, and adjustments that reflected the very decisions he had made. All of them had traces of oversight, mistakes, or unintended exposure. A form left unsigned, a notice delivered to the wrong office, a clerk who questioned instructions that seemed irregular. He could no longer control everything. Small slips became public. The careful exclusion, the deliberate erasures, the hidden decisions, all began to leak through the cracks. Emails forwarded to unintended recipients. An accountant, unaware of the full history, sending copies to the wrong address. An extended family member asking questions that could not be easily brushed aside. Each instance was minor on its own, but collected together they painted a clear picture. I observed quietly, recording the shifts, noting every signal. Nothing in my behavior changed outwardly. I remained compliant, polite, present only in form, absent in acknowledgement. The most striking consequence was not legal or financial. It was social. Conversations that had once been cordial became tense for him. Subtle questions about decisions, mentions of his actions in passing, created unease. People began to see inconsistencies without realizing the full scope. His carefully curated image, disciplined, measured, authoritative, was quietly cracking. Witnesses, even those previously uninvolved, began to provide indirect validation. A colleague of his who had only glimpsed part of the plan mentioned details that aligned with what I had already observed. A neighbor recounted hearing a conversation that confirmed exclusion. A clerk at a legal office inadvertently exposed a signature discrepancy. All of it accumulated, slowly, inevitably. I did not intervene. I did not claim recognition. I did not demand correction, because the system was self-revealing. And the truth, once present in these fragments, could not be fully concealed again. The father I had known, the figure who had controlled everything quietly, carefully, without confrontation, was now facing consequences he had never anticipated. I watched him adjust subtly. Micro decisions he had once made with ease now required effort. A pause here, a reconsideration there. The careful balance of exclusion and authority he had maintained for years became impossible to sustain without error. The systems that had protected his decisions no longer functioned perfectly. I saw the strain in his demeanor, though he never admitted it. A hand lingered on a document for longer than usual. Eyes flicked to notes and letters more often. Small irritations surfaced in private conversations, glimpses of frustration that he never revealed publicly. And yet, nothing about the household changed for me. I maintained my routine, my restraint, my silence. I did not confront, I did not demand acknowledgement. The consequences unfolded entirely through reality and observation. It was deliberate and complete. Quiet, invisible to most, yet undeniable to those who paid attention. Even the extended family, once complicit in maintaining the illusion of control, began asking questions. Innocuous questions, polite inquiries, neutral observations. Nothing accusatory, nothing dramatic, but enough to destabilize the carefully maintained structure. I remained in the background, silent, observant, detached, and it was enough, because consequences do not need an audience to be effective. They are consequences whether you witness them or not. They accumulate quietly through missteps, oversights, and inevitable exposure. By the end of the month, the house had shifted, not dramatically, not visibly to outsiders, but subtly, irrevocably. Decisions once taken for granted now required explanation. Authority once assumed now faced questions. The carefully curated order he had maintained was no longer seamless. And I, who had remained restrained throughout, had done nothing but wait. Watch, observe. The truth had emerged, not because I demanded it, not because I exposed it, but because reality has a way of asserting itself in the absence of perfection. And the most profound consequence of all, he could no longer fully control what he had so carefully orchestrated. The files, the calls, the letters, they had done their work without interference. Witnesses had spoken in subtle ways, systems had revealed errors, and the structure he had relied on had begun to crack. And I remained quiet, because there is a difference between witnessing consequences and seeking them. I had chosen the former, and the weight of that choice, as always, was mine alone to carry. The house was quiet. The patterns were shifting. The control had weakened. And the truth, at last, could no longer be denied. The house was colder that December than I remembered it ever being. Not the chill of weather, but the kind that settles when absence becomes permanent. My father's presence was no longer a constant, quiet authority. It had receded entirely, removed, finalized, sealed in the systems he had once controlled with such precision. I moved through the rooms as I always had, observing, cataloging, noting absence where presence had once been assumed. The routines remained, but hollow. Decorations still stood in their familiar places. Meals were still served on the same plates. Yet everything felt like a set piece of a life I no longer belonged to. There was no apology, no explanation, no acknowledgement, and I did not expect one. I sat quietly in the living room, letter in hand, thinking of the years of observation, restraint, and silent endurance. The betrayal had been deliberate, meticulous, irreversible. And still, I felt no need to speak, no need to confront, no desire to reclaim acknowledgement that would never come. The truth had revealed itself in systems, witnesses, and consequences. That was enough. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, indifferent to plans, decisions, or omissions. I listened, I noted, and I let it be. Nothing celebrated, nothing declared, just clarity, just silence, just the weight of what remained. And in that quiet, I realized that sometimes the heaviest endings carry no spectacle, only a calm, enduring truth.